Somewhere beneath the streets of Manhattan, deeper than the subway lines most New Yorkers ride every day, there are spaces that engineers cannot fully account for. Passages that appear on some maps and not others. Chambers that workers stumbled into during routine excavations, and then just as quietly sealed back up. A city underneath the city that has been accumulating for so long that nobody alive has ever seen all of it at once. That is not a metaphor. That is the actual condition of the ground beneath one of the most studied, most documented, most obsessively engineered urban environments on the planet. And somehow, it is still full of things nobody can completely explain. What makes New York different from other cities with old infrastructure is not just the age of it, though the layers do go back further than most people realize. It is the scale, the density, the way every generation of builders dug into what the last generation left behind without always knowing what they were cutting through. Engineers working on modern projects have broken into tunnels that were not on any official record. Historians have found references in old documents to routes and chambers that have never been physically located. Urban explorers have photographed spaces that the city does not officially acknowledge exist. This is not one secret. It is dozens of overlapping ones. What you are about to hear is not a single conspiracy or a neat hidden network waiting to be revealed. It is something more interesting and more complicated than that. It is layers. Layers of infrastructure built and forgotten. Layers of history that the city paved over before anyone thought to write it down properly. Layers of engineering decisions that made perfect sense at the time and left behind puzzles that experts are genuinely still debating. The story moves between things that are documented and things that are disputed, between engineering problems with known solutions and engineering problems that are still open, between history you can find in the archives and theories that refuse to go away no matter how many times someone tries to close the file on them. Before we go any further, something I genuinely want to know. Where are you listening to this right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. There is something strange and worth acknowledging about the fact that people in completely different parts of the world, different time zones, different cities built on their own buried secrets, are all pausing on the same question at the same moment. I find that oddly fitting for a story about the hidden layers beneath a place, because every city has them, spaces that the surface does not advertise, histories that got buried along with the foundations. New York just has more of them than most. And some of them, even after generations of digging, mapping, arguing, and excavating, remain genuinely, stubbornly, fascinatingly unresolved. That is where we are starting, right at the edge of what is known. Before the skyline existed, before the grid existed, before any of it, the land that would become New York was something almost unrecognizable to anyone who walks its streets today. Manhattan was not flat. It was not stable. It was not a single coherent piece of terrain waiting to be organized. It was a landscape of steep ridges and sudden valleys, of tidal marshes that shifted with the seasons, of streams cutting down through soil toward the harbor in a dozen different directions. The Lenape, who lived there for thousands of years, knew those streams by name. They knew which ground would hold and which would swallow you if you stepped wrong. They understood the terrain the way people do when survival depends on it. The Europeans who arrived did not erase that landscape immediately. They built on top of it, around it, awkwardly alongside it for longer than most people realize. Early Dutch colonial maps show a Manhattan that looks almost nothing like the island you can see from a plane today. Marshland running deep into what is now Lower Manhattan, a canal cutting through what is now Canal Street, which is not a coincidence. A stream called the Collect Pond that once supplied fresh water to most of the early settlement, and then, as the city crowded in around it, became an open sewer so toxic that the neighborhood around it collapsed into one of the worst slums on the continent. The pond was filled in. The stream was buried. The neighborhood was eventually cleared and replaced and cleared again. And now, underneath a section of Lower Manhattan that most visitors pass through without a second thought, the ghost of that water still exists, because water does not stop moving just because someone fills in its bed. Groundwater follows the same paths it always followed. Engineers working on foundations in certain parts of Lower Manhattan have broken through into conditions that only make sense if you know the old hydrology. Unexpected saturation, pressure in places where there should not be pressure. The buried Collect Pond still asserts itself, still reminds whoever is digging that it was there first. That is one stream. Manhattan had dozens of them, and each one, as the city grew, got buried, got built over, got forgotten by the next generation of builders who only saw the street above and not the water moving invisibly beneath it. The records from that era are incomplete in ways that would surprise you. Maps from different decades contradict each other. A waterway that appears clearly on a survey from 1780 might be entirely absent from one drawn 20 years later. Not because it was gone, but because whoever commissioned the second map had different priorities. Infrastructure decisions were made by people who had access to some information and not others, who were solving immediate problems without worrying particularly about what they were leaving behind for the next problem to encounter. The grading of Manhattan is its own chapter. When the commissioner's plan imposed the famous street grid in 1811, the city did not simply draw lines on flat land. It drew lines over a terrain that did not cooperate. Hills were cut down. Valleys were filled in. Bedrock in some places came within a few feet of the surface. In others, it dropped away far below, leaving long stretches of soft soil and marsh that would cause enormous trouble for every generation of engineers who tried to dig through them afterward. The outer boroughs have their own versions of this. Brooklyn sat on a glacial moraine, a ridge of material deposited by retreating ice, which gave it uneven ground and unexpected buried boulders that work crews still strike today. Queens had wetlands and tidal inlets that were filled over the course of decades, sometimes with material that was never cataloged properly. The Bronx had river valleys and rock formations that made underground construction a genuine gamble. Staten Island had its own buried waterways, its own landscape of filled ground and hidden geology. All of this happened before anyone dug the first serious tunnel, before the aqueduct, before the subway, before the utility conduits and the fiber optic cables and the pneumatic tubes. Every major underground project was dug into a landscape that had already been profoundly altered from its original form. And the alterations were not always well documented by the time the next crew arrived with shovels. Here is what that means in practice. An engineer in 1900 digging under Lower Manhattan was not working through virgin ground. They were working through 2.5 centuries of landfill, buried rubble, old cellars, abandoned wells, and filled waterways, some of which appeared in historical records and some of which did not. When they encountered something unexpected, they often had no way to cross-reference it against a reliable map because no such map existed. They solved the immediate problem in front of them, which sometimes meant sealing off whatever they had found and moved on. That pattern repeated itself. The engineers who came in 1930 encountered what the 1900 crew had left behind, plus what the 1860 crew had left before that, plus the original buried landscape underneath everything. The documentation was always partial. The institutional memory was always imperfect. Companies folded. Records were lost in fires. Decisions made verbally on job sites were never written down at all. This is why so many of the deeper mysteries of New York's underground make far more sense when you zoom out and look at the landscape that preceded the city. The strange pressure anomalies, the passages that connect buildings that were never supposed to be connected, the spaces that appear on some surveys and vanish from others. A lot of what looks like deliberate concealment or conspiracy is actually something older and less dramatic. The accumulated confusion of generations of people building on top of terrain they only partially understood over a buried city that most of them had already forgotten was there. The city was always layered. The tunnels came later. But to understand why those tunnels surprise people, why engineers still dispute certain sections of them, you have to understand what was already down there before the first serious shovel went in. And a lot of it was already very strange. So when the first serious tunnels did arrive, they arrived into all of that, into buried streams and filled marshland and cellars. Nobody had mapped and ground that behaved differently from block to block, depending on what the previous century had deposited into it. And the people who dug them were working with instruments and methods that by any modern standard were astonishingly crude. The 19th century transformed New York underground before it transformed it above. Most people think of the city's infrastructure as something that followed the growth. It did not. In many cases, it was trying to keep pace with a population that was doubling and doubling again faster than any system could absorb. By the 1830s, Manhattan had a water crisis. The wells that early settlers had relied on were contaminated, the buried streams were gone or fouled, and the city was running on water that was quietly making people sick. The answer was the Croton Aqueduct, a 41-mile gravity-fed system that brought clean water down from Westchester County and delivered it into distributing reservoirs sitting right in the middle of the island. To do that, engineers had to tunnel through rock, bridge valleys, navigate terrain that their instruments could not fully characterize from the surface. They made it work, but the surveys they relied on were imprecise by any modern measure, and in several places the alignment shifted mid-construction when what the crew actually found underground did not match what the maps predicted. After the water came the sewers, and after the sewers came the arguments about what to do with the streets, which by the 1850s and 1860s were so choked with horses and people and wagons that the city was beginning to suffocate from its own density. Someone had to move people underground. The question was how, and who would pay for it, and who would control it. This is where politics enters the underground and does not leave. Alfred Beach had an answer. He was the editor of Scientific American, and in 1870, he opened a short pneumatic transit tunnel running beneath Broadway for a single block, designed to demonstrate that passengers could be moved through a tube by air pressure. It was elegant, genuinely clever, and almost immediately controversial. Boss Tweed, who controlled the city's politics and its contracts, had competing interests in street transit, and wanted nothing to do with a system that bypassed his influence. Beach had built the demonstration tunnel essentially in secret, obtaining a permit for a pneumatic mail tube, and then quietly expanding the project into something far more ambitious. When he opened it to the public, New Yorkers lined up by the thousands to ride through the tiled, carpeted waiting room and into the tube. The response was extraordinary. The politics were impossible. The project went nowhere. The tunnel sat unused for years, then was sealed, then was forgotten. In 1912, workers digging the City Hall station for the new subway broke through into Beach's tunnel by accident. It had been sitting in the dark for decades. The original waiting room was still there. There are accounts that a wooden car was still on the tracks. Nobody had been down there since before most of the people digging the subway were born. And suddenly there it was, a working piece of infrastructure from another era, sitting intact beneath Broadway, because nobody had ever had a particular reason to remove it. That story is unusual in its specifics, but completely normal in its underlying logic. The 19th century was full of infrastructure experiments that were proposed, partially built, abandoned, or superseded before they were ever fully completed. The people who came after did not always know what had been started and left unfinished below them. And because the city grew so fast, because blocks were built over and streets were regraded and buildings were demolished and replaced, the physical evidence of earlier work could disappear from the surface without anyone deliberately erasing it. The early utility tunnels are their own category entirely. Gas lines went in starting in the 1820s. Telegraph conduits followed, steam pipes eventually, electrical cables. Each new system required digging, and each round of digging took place with imperfect knowledge of what the previous round had installed. Some of these early conduits were mapped carefully. Many were mapped in ways that became illegible or inaccessible as the companies that installed them merged or failed or simply stopped maintaining their records. When a crew struck an unexpected pipe or a bricked arch or a void beneath a street, they were often encountering the remnant of a system that someone had laid 50 years earlier without leaving adequate documentation for anyone who might come after. Not every hidden tunnel was hidden on purpose. That is the point that gets lost in the more dramatic tellings. Most of what became obscure did so through a process that was entirely mundane. A company going bankrupt, a record destroyed in a fire, a decision made verbally on a construction site, a building going up over an access point and eliminating the last visible sign of what lay below. The secrecy, where it exists, is mostly accidental. The forgetting was almost never deliberate, but it accumulated, layer by layer, decade by decade. Each generation of builders added to what the city could no longer fully account for. By the time the subway arrived at the very end of the 19th century, there was already a version of the underground that the engineers doing the new work could not completely reconstruct from available records. They were digging into a city that had been burying things under itself for 150 years. And then they started burying things too. When the subway finally opened in 1904, it did not arrive as a clean singular system. It arrived as a compromise. A set of lines negotiated between private companies, the city government, property owners, and the limits of what engineers thought they could force through the bedrock without bankrupting everybody involved. The result was not a single network, but a series of overlapping empires underground, each with its own priorities and each built in stages. From the surface, what we see now looks coherent. Colored routes on a map, a station name on a green globe, stairs that go down and then eventually back up somewhere else. It feels like one thing. Below the tiles, it is not one thing at all. There is the subway New Yorkers know, the public platforms, the tunnels that carry riders, the mezzanines where people change trains or buy a Metro card. Then there's the subway that is not for passengers, the crew rooms, the electrical substations, the relay cabinets, the fan plants, the narrow passageways where workers duck behind live tracks. Woven through and around both is something stranger still. The subway that used to exist. The parts that were planned and never finished. Opened and then closed. Built for a role they no longer play. These last pieces are the ones that feed the idea of a hidden second city beneath the official one. You see traces of it even if you are not looking. The walled-up arch at the end of a platform. The ghostly staircase that rises to meet a ceiling that no longer has a doorway. The track that continues past the station lights and disappears into black. Most of those lead nowhere dramatic. Many end in a few yards of service ledge, a storage alcove, a simple dead end. But they exist because at some point, in some office, on some drawing board that might or might not still survive, there was a plan, an anticipated connection, a station extension, a future line that never quite arrived. Across the system, there are abandoned platforms that once took passengers and do not anymore. 91st Street on the 1 line closed when longer trains made its short platform obsolete. Worth Street shuttered when nearby stations could handle the same load more efficiently. The lower level at Bergen Street in Brooklyn. The second platform at 42nd Street Port Authority. Dozens of places where infrastructure was built with every expectation that the public would use it, only for ridership patterns and operating decisions to turn against them. Then there are unfinished stations. Shells dug out, partly tiled, wired enough to be technically usable, and then left. The lower level under 42nd Street at 7th Avenue, sometimes used for storing trains. The rough spaces cut into rock along lines where engineers intended additional platforms, crossovers, or exits that never made it into the final capital plan. Technically, they are not abandoned because they were never fully opened. In practice, they exist as empty rooms in the dark, known to a handful of planners and the crews who occasionally walk past them. Layered on top of that are sealed passages, some once connected stations that are now linked by different routes. Others allowed exits into buildings that were demolished or reconfigured. Still others existed for reasons that made sense in the operating environment of 1920, but do not in 2026. Crowd flows that no longer occur. Fare controls that have been redesigned. When those needs went away, the cheapest solution was often to brick up the corridor, lock the door at one end, and let the city forget that the volume of air behind it still exists. Engineers distinguish carefully between these categories. Public space is what a rider can legally reach. Anything within the fare control area, any corridor or stair that is part of an active emergency route. Employee-only infrastructure is what keeps that visible system working. The machine rooms, the fan galleries, the cable ducts, the control booths, and signal rooms. Truly disused tunnels and platforms are the leftovers, the pieces for which there is no day-to-day role. From the outside, all three can blur together. A metal door with a faded sign might hide a transformer room, or a disused cross passage, or an active ventilation shaft. A dark arch beyond the end of a platform might be a short relay space, or an entire unused level, or nothing at all. The fact that most of those distinctions are invisible to riders makes it easy for the imagination to flatten them into one category. Secret. Take City Hall Station, probably the most famous abandoned station in New York. It is beautiful. Arched Guastavino tiles, chandeliers, curved tracks that bend in a way the straight platforms of the numbered lines do not. It opened with the first subway in 1904 and closed in 1945, when longer trains and new boarding patterns made its sharply curved platform impractical. The structure remains connected to the active system. Trains still pass through it every day as they loop from the southbound 6-track back to the northbound side at Brooklyn Bridge. Nothing about City Hall is hidden, in the sense of being unknown to the agencies that run the subway. It is documented, inspected, maintained enough that it will not simply collapse. For years, transit enthusiasts could legally visit it on occasional tours. And yet, because regular passengers no longer step onto its platform, it occupies a liminal status in the public imagination, something grand that exists but cannot quite be reached. Other remnants sit lower in the hierarchy of knowledge. There are places where passengers glimpse tiled station names that do not appear on any current map, flickering past the window in the tunnel wall. There are stub tunnels that extend past the end of an active line, built with the thought that someday funding and political will would continue the route farther into Brooklyn or Queens or the Bronx. There are bell mouths, wide flared openings where a future branch was meant to split off, still carved into the rock, waiting for trains that never came. To say that even insiders do not have a simple picture of all of this is not a conspiracy claim. It is an acknowledgement of scale and time. The subway is more than a century old in many parts. It was first built by private companies with their own record-keeping habits, then taken over by the city, then consolidated, reorganized, and partially computerized in waves. Drawings were redrafted, standards changed, fires destroyed archives, offices moved and files were lost. Some records exist but are effectively inaccessible, trapped in obsolete formats or unlabeled boxes in off-site storage. Within the agencies that run the system, knowledge is often local and experiential. Track crews know the idiosyncrasies of their section. Signal maintainers know where the old equipment lives. Veteran operators know where the light shifts in the tunnel because there is a side chamber or a forgotten air shaft. But no single person walks around with a complete, accurate mental map of every obsolete connection, every sealed stair, every unnumbered passage. The master maps that do exist are abstractions, focused on what matters for operations and safety today. Complicating it further is the way the system grew. It was not dug as a single set of tubes and then left alone. It was extended line by line, contract by contract, often with the understanding that future sections would hook in later. When those later projects were delayed, repurposed, or canceled outright, the physical preparations for them sometimes remained. A cut-off wall here, a curved alignment there, a short length of tunnel bored toward a destination that was eventually served by a completely different route. In some areas, this created literal overlaps. Upper levels, lower levels, mezzanines that cross above one line to reach another, passageways that once allowed transfers between two competing systems and now sit bricked behind advertising panels. In others, it left voids, pockets of rock that were hollowed out, lined and then quietly sidelined when construction priorities shifted a block or two away. None of this adds up to a coherent second city with streets and addresses beneath the subway. It does, however, create something that can feel, in certain moments, like the outline of one. A set of rooms and corridors, platforms and tunnels, stacked and stitched together by a century of partial plans. Spaces that are official but unused, known but rarely visited, technically mapped but practically forgotten. For the people who work down there, these are engineering facts. For the people who peer through a dirty train window and catch a glimpse of a lit but empty platform passing by, they are something else. Proof, or at least suggestion, that there is more under New York than the part anyone is meant to see. And beneath even that, below the tracks and platforms and storage tunnels carved for trains, there is another layer again: water, pressure, and geology that did not care in the slightest what human beings wanted to build on top of it. Long before engineers argued about where to put a station entrance, they had to answer a harder question. Where exactly did the ground stop being ground and start being water? On a map, New York looks firm. Boroughs drawn in clear outlines, streets forming a grid, rivers neatly shaded blue. Underground, those boundaries blur. The island of Manhattan is not a single smooth block of rock. It is a spine of hard schist and gneiss interrupted by seams of weaker material. The edges fray into old river channels, glacial deposits, and fill whatever past generations dumped to make the shoreline a little bigger. Brooklyn and Queens are even more complicated. Sand, clay, and silt layered like a shuffled deck of cards, soaked through with groundwater that moves according to rules that do not respect property lines. When the first big tunnels were proposed, under the East River, under the Hudson, many experts thought they were impossible. Not because they had never been done anywhere, but because New York's particular mix of rock, mud, and tide seemed too unstable. You were not just digging through soil and stone. You were trying to carve a space in a sponge that was already full. That sponge fights back. Drill into waterlogged ground and water comes to meet you. In some places it seeps. In others it jets. A pinhole in a compressed layer can turn into a sand boil. A live fountain of grit and water that erodes whatever supports you thought you had. Clay that looks solid in a core sample can turn into toothpaste under pressure. Sand can liquefy. Even the bedrock itself, where it exists, is fractured. Those fractures are natural pipes, carrying groundwater along invisible paths. For modern engineers, these are design challenges. For anyone trying to decode what was built a century ago, they are also sources of confusion. An old tunnel drawing might show a simple arch passing cleanly beneath a river. The physical structure today could be anything but simple. Groundwater infiltration over decades might have forced extra lining, internal shells, or patchwork repairs. Repeated wetting and drying might have corroded the original steel ribs, or weakened the concrete. Somewhere along the way, a leak that nobody anticipated might have found a path from an overhead sewer, or a buried stream, or a forgotten well. Stand in a maintenance passage in one of those older crossings, and you can see it in the surfaces. Patches, grout injections, mineral blooms crusted over bolt heads. Each mark is an engineering decision made because water and pressure did something the original designers did not fully expect. Not every one of those decisions is carefully documented. Some live only in a note on a contractor's invoice, or in the memory of a crew chief who retired 3 decades ago. The Hudson River tunnels, the East River tunnels, the aqueducts that bring drinking water from upstate. They were all, in their time, experiments as much as infrastructure. To force a human-sized void through soft, water-charged ground, builders relied on caissons and shields. Giant iron or steel cylinders pushed forward inch by inch, holding back the earth while men dug inside them. To keep the water out, they filled those spaces with compressed air at pressures high enough to counteract the river above. It worked most of the time. It was also deadly. Workers suffered decompression sickness when they came back to normal pressure too fast. The bends that twisted joints and damaged nerves. Explosions could tear open the working face. A misjudged seam in the riverbed could blow out, instantly flooding a partially completed tunnel with a column of water and silt. From the perspective of the 21st century, those methods seem heroic and reckless at the same time. From the perspective of the tunnels themselves, they left a complicated legacy. Caissons were sometimes left in place and buried. Temporary bulkheads became permanent. Emergency grouting campaigns changed the way ground loads transferred onto the tunnel shell. In a few cases, entire alignments were nudged during construction to avoid a bad patch of soil. Then nudged again later to tie into a station that had drifted on the drawing board. The official record might show a neat curve. The structure in the ground might trace a slightly different line. All of this would be challenging enough in stable terrain. New York's is not always stable. The city is built over old streams that were culverted, wetlands that were filled, piers that were demolished and replaced with land. Over time, that fill settles. Wooden piles rot when groundwater levels drop and leave them alternately wet and dry. Deep excavations for new basements or foundations change the way water moves through the subsurface. Pumping for construction dewaters an area temporarily, lowering the water table. When the pumps stop, water returns along new routes. Every time that subterranean water network shifts, it can subtly change the forces on existing tunnels. A section of lining that was once bone dry might start to seep. Joints might open fractions of an inch. A brick sewer from the 1890s that nobody has thought about in years might begin taking on more flow and pressurizing in storms, weeping through its walls into nearby structures. Engineers see these effects as movement and leakage. To a historian trying to reconcile what is on paper with what is in the field, they can look like anomalies, unexpected walls, extra thicknesses of concrete, mysterious cavities where drawings show solid ground. Sometimes they are the scars of a specific incident, a sinkhole that opened under a street, a leak that undermined a track bed, a cold winter that froze a seep and fractured the lining. Sometimes they are cumulative, decades of small patch jobs, each solving a local problem, adding up to a configuration no original designer ever envisioned. The material itself complicates the picture further. Steel corrodes, especially in the presence of salt water, road salts, and stray electrical currents. Concrete chemically reacts with that same groundwater, with a slow process called leaching that can leave voids or crusty deposits. Bricks absorb and release moisture, grow efflorescent salts, and sometimes crack. Insulation, gaskets, waterproofing membranes. Many of the products used in early tunnel construction had service lives far shorter than the tunnels themselves. As those materials age and are replaced piece by piece, the structure's original logic gets obscured. A cast iron ring from 1907 might sit next to a welded steel liner from a 1970s rehabilitation, bolted to a sprayed concrete repair from the 2000s. To a maintenance engineer, this is a practical palimpsest. the product of keeping a vital artery open. To anyone else poking around in the records, it can look like a riddle with several missing pages. Add in undocumented repairs, and the uncertainty deepens. Not every grouting job, injecting cement under pressure into voids around a tunnel, is captured in final as-builts. Not every small-scale underpinning of foundations near a station is given its own detailed map. In emergency conditions, the priority is to stop the leak, stabilize the ground, reopen service. Paperwork follows later, if at all. Over a century, that gap accumulates. There are places beneath New York where evidence suggests something was done. A zone of unusually dense concrete around a tunnel, a pattern of settlement at the surface, an odd kink in the lining, and yet the why of it is unclear. Somewhere, once water and soil and man-made structure interacted in a way that forced a decision. The decision remains, hardened into the fabric of the city. The explanation does not always accompany it. Modern technology helps, but it does not erase this ambiguity. Inspectors can't simply walk everywhere. Some crossings run deep under rivers with no convenient side passages. Others are so constrained by live tracks, high voltage equipment, and confined spaces that only partial visual checks are realistic. Remote cameras, ground-penetrating radar, sonar surveys from the river above, all provide fragments of information. None substitute for tearing open a tunnel to see exactly how it was built, and tearing open vital tunnels is a luxury the city rarely has. In a few extreme cases, the only practical knowledge of an older structure's condition comes from indirect clues, slight variations in track geometry, patterns of dampness, subtle measurements of how much the lining flexes under passing trains. Engineers infer what must be happening behind the walls from these hints, the way doctors infer internal problems from external symptoms. That inferential gap is one of the reasons some underground spaces remain stubbornly hard to categorize. The path of a forgotten feeder tunnel may be suspected but not definitively mapped. The original purpose of a walled-off chamber adjacent to a river crossing may be guessed at from its location and shape, but not fully confirmed without compromising the very waterproofing that keeps the river out. The line between we know and we think is not always as bright as people imagine. Outsiders sometimes interpret this as secrecy, as if agencies are hiding a complete set of answers. Often, the reality is simpler and stranger. The answers do not exist in any single place. They are scattered between old, incomplete drawings, the observable behavior of aging structures under pressure, and the memories of people who spent their careers watching the city's hidden hydraulics misbehave. Layer water over everything, the rivers, the tides, the groundwater, the leaks, and the notion of a clean, fully documented, easily explained underground dissolves. What remains is a living system, tunnels that flex with temperature and load, linings that creep and crack, soils that settle and swell, old streams that still try to follow their paths, even when those paths now run through concrete. Into that system, generations have inserted not just subways, but sewers, water mains, power conduits, and utility galleries. Some of those, too, have been altered, rerouted, reinforced in response to forces nobody fully foresaw. And it is in the shadows around them, where older infrastructure meets newer layers, that some of New York's most obscure underground spaces take shape. Those are the corridors and chambers that do not appear on tourist maps, that may or may not appear in current engineering records, that sit between categories. Not quite public, not quite abandoned, not quite fully understood. To find them, you have to look not just at where people wanted to go, but at where the water pushed back and forced them to improvise. And where engineers improvised, they often left behind things that do not fit neatly into any modern definition of tunnel or room or shaft at all. Fragments of a buried infrastructure story that blend into the next layer of mystery, the forgotten systems and sealed passages that run through the city's underbelly, quietly outliving the plans that created them. If you strip away the romance of secret societies and hidden bases, one of the strangest things about New York's underground is how much of it was built for very ordinary reasons. Start, for instance, with something as unglamorous as mail. In the early 20th century, before email, before reliable airmail, the city tried to solve a simple problem. How do you move letters across Manhattan without fighting street traffic? One answer ran beneath people's feet. Small diameter tunnels carrying pneumatic tubes once shot canisters of mail between post offices. Compressed air on one end, vacuum on the other, steel capsules racing through the dark. Some segments were big enough to crawl through. Others were little more than steel pipes in a trench. For a while, this system was a marvel of modern logistics. Then traffic patterns changed, technology moved on, and piece by piece, the network was decommissioned. On modern maps, most of those lines are gone. The street-level buildings they served have been repurposed. Yet in basements and sub-basements, engineers still encounter odd stub-outs of cast-iron pipe, brick-lined drifts that don't connect to anything obvious, sealed collars in the walls of utility rooms. They're fragments of a mail system the city no longer uses, but which has not been fully excavated either. In the absence of a clear label, pneumatic tube, 1907 abandoned, those fragments become puzzles. Scale that pattern up, and you begin to see how secret tunneling can emerge from simple access needs. Every major utility in New York has its own underworld. Electricity travels not just in familiar manholes and curbside transformers, but in cable vaults and duct banks, reinforced concrete corridors filled with conduits, some large enough for a person to walk, others only for pulling cables through with winches. Steam, piped from central plants to heat and cool buildings, rides in thickly insulated pipes that snake under avenues, wrapped in protective casings to contain both heat and, if something goes wrong, high-pressure leaks. Telecommunications, phone lines, fiber optics, legacy coax occupy their own trays and chases. Tie these systems together and you get service corridors, modest tunnels running parallel to subway lines, skirting around basements, slipping under plazas to reach clusters of towers. For workers who use them daily, these are just back halls of the city, places to reach a valve or a splice without tearing up the street. To anyone peeking in from the outside, they look like exactly the thing urban legends promise. Long, dim passages vanishing into the distance, doors at intervals, heavy cables overhead, the scent of oil and dust and age. Very few of these spaces were ever meant for public eyes. Their geometry follows the needs of pipes and wires, not the logic of passenger flow. A corridor might narrow suddenly because a building's foundation juts into its path. It might dead end at a crude block wall poured long after the original excavation, when a later project decided to claim part of the space. Stairs rise to locked hatches that once opened into utility rooms in now remodeled buildings. Signage fades. Lights that were installed as temporary work lamps decades ago become, by attrition, the only illumination. From inside, this can feel less like an organized network and more like a series of clues to earlier intents. When infrastructure is taken out of service, it is rarely erased cleanly. Demolition is noisy, expensive, and risky, especially when the obsolete line sits next to ones the city still depends on. So engineers compromise. A disused steam branch might be drained, capped, and left buried. An old cable vault might have its cables removed, but its concrete shell left in place. Its access stair sealed at the top with a slab and a layer of asphalt. A minor connector tunnel, used once to route temporary services during construction, might be bricked up at both ends, its existence reduced to a faint line on a yellowing plan. From above, the street looks unchanged. In the records, the notation next to a structure's ID number might shift from active to abandoned, filled, or no longer in service. In the ground, a void may still remain. Sometimes it is literally filled, with sand or grout pumped in to prevent collapse. Sometimes filled means functionally. No one expects to use it again, so it drops out of the mental map. Those mental maps, however, were never perfectly synchronized between agencies to begin with. The subway operator maintains its own drawings, focused on tracks, signals, and station structures. The water department tracks mains, sewers, and valves. Power companies maintain cable routes and manholes. Private building owners control their basement expansions and service penetrations. Where these systems intersect, coordination improves, because physical collision forces conversation. Where they merely pass near each other, history accumulates in layers. Each new project generalizes what came before into a simple shape. Existing utility, protect as required. Look at a contemporary engineering plan, and you'll see it in the symbology. Sensitive conduits, carrying high voltage feeders, fiber for emergency communications, or control cables for critical facilities, may be shown only as a dashed corridor with no annotation. Details live in restricted documents or in the heads of specialists. Security policy is one reason. Precise routes for government communications or power lines to major installations are not advertised casually. Liability and clutter are others. If every legacy pipe, orphaned duct, and exploratory borehole were meticulously drawn, the page would turn black. The consequence, from the outside, is a gap. Satellite imagery shows a cluster of government or financial buildings. Surface maps show nothing remarkable beneath them. Then a contractor opens the street and finds a concrete gallery that does not match any public record. Word spreads. Photos circulate. To people primed by stories of hidden bunkers, it looks like confirmation. To the utility engineer, it's an old joint-use tunnel, perhaps once shared by multiple companies, quietly sealed on one end when a new alignment opened, and then quietly forgotten. Even maintenance access routes for familiar structures can feed the same sense of mystery. Consider the subway beneath the subway effect in a different context. Many stations have non-public circulation, narrow catwalks behind walls, offset passages that bypass the platform, crossovers at odd elevations, all built so workers can reach equipment without walking along active tracks. Some were added long after the original station opened, to comply with evolving safety codes or to reach new rooms carved into old fabric. To commuters, the visible layout is simple. Stairs, mezzanine, platform. To someone with a key, there is another network tucked just out of sight. When a piece of that network is amputated, because a new elevator shaft cuts through it, or a building project reroutes egress, the leftover segment may become an orphan. Brick up its ends and it turns, overnight, from useful passage into sealed room. Its existence persists mostly in someone's recollection that there used to be a way through here, and in a faint, unlabeled rectangle on an as-built. Years later, when a different crew exposes a fragment of that rectangle, the original story may have vanished. The structure, however, is as tangible as ever. An arched roof, old paint, maybe a length of disconnected handrail, enough to convince any curious person that they've stumbled onto something deliberately hidden. The pattern repeats under office towers, hospitals, campuses. Steam rooms, once central to a building's mechanical heart, are bypassed when a new plant goes online. Old electrical switchgear rooms are abandoned when equipment becomes too obsolete or too dangerous to maintain. Service corridors that linked multiple properties under a common ownership lose their purpose when those properties are sold off and renovated independently. No one spends money to dig these spaces out. They're too inconvenient to use and too awkward to remove. So they become voids, quietly aging behind walls that newer tenants assume are solid. In a city as dense as New York, the practical invisibility of these voids transforms them in the collective imagination. A passageway that once carried nothing more exotic than chilled water or bundled telephone pairs starts to acquire a different aura once its function is forgotten. The more its details are blurred on paper, for security, for simplicity, or through sheer neglect, the easier it is to project other stories into it. From an engineering standpoint, this can be frustrating. Many of the so-called mystery tunnels that occasionally surface in headlines turn out, on close inspection, to be maintenance corridors, old sewers, utility chases, access routes for ventilation shafts. Their cross-sections, linings, and relationships to nearby structures often give away their purpose to trained eyes. Yet even for those trained eyes, there are still enough edge cases, enough sealed doors with no clear label, enough galleries that do not quite line up with current plans, to keep certainty elusive. It is in that gap between the mundane and the unknown that New York's forgotten infrastructure lives. Not in purpose-built labyrinths for conspirators, but in yesterday's best solutions to yesterday's very practical problems, left in place as today's systems routed around them. Ordinary tunnels, stripped of their context, become strange by default. And once you accept that, the next layer of stories, the passages tied less to utilities and more to power, security, and contingency, becomes harder to dismiss outright. If a city can misplace its own mail tubes and cable vaults, what else might it have buried, intentionally or otherwise, beneath the streets? Power changes the way a city digs. A steam line or a cable duct can be drawn on a plan in fairly plain language. A passage that connects a courthouse to a detention center or a mayor's office to a hardened command post rarely is. The closer a space comes to the machinery of government, finance, or emergency response, the less likely it is to sit in a stack of easily accessible drawings. New York has several layers of that kind of space, some documented, some rumored, some sitting in a gray zone where partial evidence exists, but the full story does not. Take government complexes first. The courts around Foley Square, the civic buildings downtown, the cluster of city and federal offices nearby. Together they form not just a surface district, but a kind of administrative acropolis. During the 20th century, especially in periods of unrest and war, planners worried not just about how people would get in and out during a normal day, but how they would move if things went very wrong. There is reasonably solid documentation that some of these institutions are linked by controlled underground routes. Part of this is almost prosaic. Secure transfer of detainees from holding cells to courtrooms without exposing them to the street. Part of it is driven by continuity of government planning, the idea that essential staff should be able to move, protected from weather, crowds, or attack, between key facilities. The exact layouts are, deliberately, not public. What surfaces in reports, court filings, or the recollections of contractors are fragments, references to a secured tunnel, notes about below-grade connection as per federal spec, mentions of restricted access corridor in project scopes. Enough to indicate that these routes exist, not enough to let you draw them on a tourist map. A similar pattern appears under the city's big terminals and bridges. Grand Central Terminal, for instance, is famous in urban lore for its supposed secret tracks and escape routes. Here, the line between fact and embellishment is thin. There really are lower-level tracks, service platforms, and corridors that do not appear on the simplified diagrams given to commuters. At least one track has been widely reported, though not in exhaustive official detail, as having served as a discreet boarding point for VIPs, staying at the attached hotel. The logic is straightforward. If you want to move important people quietly, you do not send them through the main concourse. Bridges and tunnels that carry road or rail traffic across rivers have their own underworld. Some of it is boringly necessary. Inspection galleries inside piers, vaulted chambers where anchorages grip massive steel cables, ventilation and control rooms that modulate airflow and monitor conditions. But because these structures are so critical and so obviously symbolic, security planning has long wrapped them in layers of contingency. During World War II and the early Cold War, civil defense planners explicitly worried about what would happen if crossings were bombed, poisoned, or blocked. Archival material points to discussions of protected access ways, shielded control centers, and emergency egress routes for staff. Not all of those ideas were built. Some that were built have since been altered beyond easy recognition. Yet the traces, odd stairways ending at locked doors, shafts that clearly lead somewhere but are labeled only with an internal code, remain. Then there are the sub-basements of major institutions, banks, exchanges, data centers, hospitals, universities, media headquarters. These are places with both valuable assets and strong reasons to stay online during crises. Many of them sit on or near long-established utility corridors. Over time, some have negotiated direct connections into those corridors, or built private passages to neighboring buildings under common ownership, or installed hardened rooms low in the structure where backup equipment and emergency operations can function. In some cases, documentation is clear. Building permits, engineering reports, glossy promotional materials celebrating state-of-the-art bunkers or resilient networks. In other cases, what exists publicly are hints. A line on a fire department pre-plan showing an emergency operations center, sub-level, or a schematic with a blanked-out zone labeled restricted. Staff with need to know understand how those areas link together. The rest of the world does not. Wartime planning added another layer of opacity. As early as the 1930s, American cities, including New York, ran air raid drills and considered scenarios that today sound like plot points from disaster fiction. Where would officials go if City Hall was threatened? How could communications be maintained if telephone exchanges were damaged? Could certain rail lines or tunnels double as shelters? Some of what was actually built in response was modest. reinforced basements designated as civil defense posts, rooms stocked with supplies, signal lines run in redundant paths. Some was more ambitious. There are references in period documents to hardened communication rooms buried under central locations and to alternate control centers set back from obvious targets. In the nuclear era, those concepts evolved into more fully realized emergency operations centers, some of which were openly acknowledged, others only hinted at. Because secrecy was a feature, not a bug. The paper trails for these facilities are often incomplete or deliberately vague. Project names are generic. Plans are misfiled or redacted. When you sift through what is available, you find enough specifics to rule out pure fantasy. Thicknesses of blast doors, capacities of air filters, load calculations for extra concrete overhead, but rarely enough to say, with confidence, exactly how any one bunker or corridor connects to the rest of the city. This is where rumor finds its foothold. When a bridge has known internal galleries, it is not a stretch for popular imagination to extend them into sweeping underground highways reserved for officials. When a courthouse clearly has some kind of secure transfer route, the story evolves into a spider web of tunnels linking every government building downtown. A heavily secured financial institution with massive vault levels becomes, in some tellings, the hub of an armored subway. Sometimes, buried in the exaggeration, there is a kernel of real infrastructure. Consider service links built for emergency operations. It is plausible, and in a few cases reasonably well documented, that certain hospitals share subsurface connections with each other or with nearby institutions to allow for protected transfer of patients, supplies, or staff. Similar protected links have been reported between critical communication hubs and power facilities, ensuring that key circuits can be maintained or rerouted without exposing workers or cables to surface chaos during a crisis. Yet the public record tends to compress all of this into phrases like hardened conduit or secure interconnection. Drawings might show a line disappearing into an unlabeled basement box with a note, "To facility by others." For security and liability reasons, details are held close. Outsiders are left to interpolate, and interpolation easily slides into narrative. That blurring is not always accidental. Agencies have long understood that advertising the precise location of sensitive tunnels or bunkers is unwise. They also know that overemphasizing their existence can cause panic or invite speculation. The result is a strange middle ground, enough information to reassure insiders that systems exist, not enough detail to satisfy the curiosity of everyone else. When something tangible does leak through, a contractor posts a photo of a concrete-lined corridor under a well-known civic building. A former employee mentions the tunnel we used to take to avoid the protests. An old blueprint surfaces at auction with a mysterious dashed line labeled only "Special Route." It tends to be seized upon as proof of much grander schemes. Engineers, confronted with these same fragments, are often more cautious. A special route might be nothing more exotic than an enlarged utility chase, sized to allow technicians safe passage. A secure connection could be a short, heavily protected run of cables between a telecom room and a nearby node. But in the absence of full documentation, and with security rules that discourage open discussion, even the most sober interpretations remain partially speculative. There are also cases where stories collide with evidence in more ambiguous ways. Oral histories from long-retired workers who swear they walked a particular tunnel in the 1960s, scattered notes, in an agency archive about decommissioning a civil defense connection in a given neighborhood. Contemporary surveys that show no such voids where memory says they should be. Was the space filled in? Reused? Misremembered? Without invasive digging, it may be impossible to say. What matters, from the standpoint of how the city understands itself, is that these half-seen structures exist at the intersection of genuine need and cultivated obscurity. They were built so that power, political, financial, operational, could move and survive under stress. They were recorded in ways that assume only a small circle of people would ever need to know the details. Decades later, that circle has turned over, but the voids are still there. In a city already riddled with forgotten mail tubes and retired cable vaults, these more sensitive tunnels gain an extra charge. They are plausible in a way that makes them hard to dismiss outright, yet secretive in a way that resists easy confirmation. Some legends almost certainly sweep together multiple mundane structures and rebrand them as parts of a single, dramatic network. Others may exaggerate real corridors into something far larger than they ever were. Between documented passages, rumored escape routes, and wartime projects whose files never quite made it into the open, the underground tied to power and security forms its own shadow layer beneath New York. Not fully mapped, not fully imaginary. It is in this layer that some of the city's most persistent stories take root, and where the line between infrastructure and myth becomes especially thin. When you have a landscape like that, real tunnels, half-documented corridors, official silence, you do not just get infrastructure, you get stories. New York's underground has accumulated folklore the way its streets collect scaffolding, layer on layer, some of it temporary, some of it strangely permanent. Ask 10 people who grew up here about secret tunnels, and you will likely hear some version of the same themes. The hidden train line that powerful people still use, the mob's private escape route under a certain neighborhood, the abandoned station where deals were done in the dark, the locked door on a platform that definitely leads to somewhere you are not supposed to know about. One of the most persistent families of stories centers on private rail for the elite. Grand Central's rumored secret train for presidents is the best-known version. It shows up in newspaper features, documentaries, casual bar talk. The basic script is consistent. Beneath the main terminal, there is a track that never appears on any public map, reserved for dignitaries and wealthy guests of the attached hotel, complete with private elevator and automobile access. From there, the story branches. In some tellings, the line continues in a protected loop under Midtown, linking discreetly to other important buildings. In others, it is a direct escape route out of the city, ready at a moment's notice. The reality, as far as public evidence goes, is more focused. There's strong, if still somewhat second-hand, documentation of a specific lower-level track serving as a discrete boarding point, at least in certain eras, for VIPs who did not want to cross the concourse. There was a freight elevator large enough to carry vehicles. Certain trains did, in fact, depart from that shy corner of the complex. From there, the legend inflates. The idea of one hidden boarding platform plugs into a broader intuition. If such a thing exists in one place, why not everywhere? The notion that powerful figures might avoid the public spaces the rest of us have to use is culturally resonant. It feels right. So an arrangement that was probably rare and logistically limited becomes, in the retelling, an entire shadow network for the elite. A similar pattern plays out with old stations and side platforms. The City Hall subway station, long closed to regular service but architecturally ornate, is a magnet for stories. People whisper about secret meetings held there after hours, private parties on the curved platform, trains that never appear on the schedule gliding through without stopping. There are fragments that support at least some of this: documented film shoots, special tours, occasional official events. In a system as complex as New York's, unused platforms and stub tracks do exist, and they are sometimes repurposed. But the evocative space, tilework, skylights, quiet, does most of the storytelling work on its own. It becomes easy to graft additional layers onto it. That somewhere behind a bricked-up arch is a staircase to a politician's office, or that a bricked recess once held a door to a bootlegger's passage. The more picturesque the ruin, the stronger the urge to populate it with clandestine activity. Then there are the mob tunnels. Stories about organized crime in New York almost inevitably sink below the sidewalk. Bootlegging in the 1920s, gambling and numbers rackets mid-century, later drug operations. All of them get attached, after the fact, to rumors of hidden basements and connecting corridors. The image is familiar: a back room behind a restaurant, a trap door, a stair into a low passage that surfaces blocks away in another unmarked door. Some documented examples do exist. Certain waterfront warehouses had concealed compartments. There were basements with knockout panels opening into neighboring cellars. In a city built with party walls and shared foundations, it is not technically difficult to knock a hole in masonry and create an unofficial link. For smugglers and gangsters, that was occasionally too useful a trick to ignore. But the urban legend frequently smooths over the difference between a rough breach in a wall and a purpose-built engineered tunnel system. An improvised hole becomes a mob subway. A story about one illicit passage becomes a claimed grid under an entire district. The intrigue of the criminal world fuses with the existing mystery of the city's hidden structures until they are treated as one and the same. Private tunnels for the wealthy follow a similar script, but with a different kind of power. Old mansions on Fifth Avenue are said to have had direct connections to nearby clubs, churches, or even to hidden platforms under the park, allowing their owners to move unseen. Certain corporate headquarters are rumored to link underground to exclusive hotels or to their own luxury residential buildings. These stories often have a kernel: actual basement connections between buildings under common ownership, or service corridors shared by a complex. Large institutions, museums, hospitals, universities, sometimes do have legitimate underground links to annexes or support buildings. There have been, over the decades, real pedestrian tunnels meant for staff, students, or patients to move without crossing busy streets or braving the weather. When one of those is confirmed, it tends to retroactively bless a dozen other, more tenuous claims. The known passage proves that they can do such things. From there, rumor takes care of the rest. New York is unusually fertile soil for this kind of legend-making because of its basic characteristics. It is dense. Enormous volumes of people, money, and material are funneled through limited surface space every day. That creates strong incentives to go underground, both for mundane functions and for specialized discrete ones. It is old, at least by American urban standards. Layers of infrastructure built for one era's needs: coal deliveries, pneumatic mail, private rail sidings, early telegraph lines, have been buried under newer systems and new priorities. Records have been lost, misfiled, or preserved only in specialized archives, and it is layered in a way that is physically tangible. You feel it when you descend from street to mezzanine to platform. aware that there are still floors beneath your feet. When a train curves past a dark side tunnel, when a grate reveals a deep shaft, you are reminded that what you can see is a fraction of what exists. Into that environment, stories spread through multiple channels, each with its own way of bending the truth. Newspapers have long played a role. Early 20th century articles sometimes blended civic pride with a taste for the sensational, describing underground cities of pipes and passages in broad, dramatic strokes. Mid-century pieces on crime or politics occasionally hinted at shadowy back routes without providing much detail. Today, features about secrets of the subway try to strike a balance between revealing curiosities and preserving mystique. Each wave of coverage adds another layer of narrative, often simplifying complex engineering into more easily retold anecdotes. Oral history adds another filter. Retired motormen, sandhogs, station agents, and maintenance workers carry memories of places the public rarely sees. Layup tracks used for storage, cross passages for staff, odd remnants of earlier construction. When these tales are passed down informally, over family dinners, in neighborhood bars, details blur. A short ventilation corridor might become, in the mind of a listener, a tunnel that goes somewhere important. A mention of moving VIPs once or twice grows in repetition into a regular service for the powerful. In recent decades, an explorer subculture has emerged at the margins. Urban explorers, some more careful than others, seek out disused stations, sealed-off platforms, ventilation shafts, catwalks along the tracks. A few publish meticulous accounts that try to separate verified space from rumor. Others lean toward drama, describing any unlit corridor as part of a secret system, even when it is clearly labeled as a maintenance way. Their photographs, grainy, half-lit, taken in forbidden spaces, circulate online stripped of context. A utility chase under a campus becomes, once removed from its caption, the hidden college tunnel. A non-revenue subway track used for equipment moves is framed as a ghost line. The internet accelerates what newspapers and bar talk once did slowly. A claim can now move from an offhand forum post to a viral "did you know" video in days, acquiring a patina of credibility simply through repetition. Some legends, viewed closely, resolve into misinterpretations of known infrastructure. Others contain that kernel of truth, a real disused spur, a documented temporary wartime connection, an authenticated VIP elevator. A few likely blend multiple separate facts into a single, more coherent myth. A maintenance shaft near a courthouse, an emergency corridor between two hospitals, and a story about a long-ago prisoner transfer may fuse into one narrative about a massive tunnel connecting all the buildings. The challenge is not just in sorting true from false, but in recognizing the gradient between evidence, inference, and speculation. Evidence might be an engineering drawing, a contract, a photograph tied reliably to a place and time. Inference is what a careful observer does when that evidence is incomplete, extrapolating that a corridor continues beyond what is shown, or that a service track must connect to a nearby yard. Speculation begins when gaps are filled with motives and uses. Who must be walking there now? What must be stored behind a sealed hatch? New York's tunnel legends thrive in those gaps. Engineers, when they weigh in, tend to default to the modest explanation. A void is probably a utility duct. A locked door probably guards a storage alcove or a safety refuge. Storytellers gravitate to the grander reading, the private escape route, the hidden command center, the forgotten train. Both perspectives feed the overall mythology. The presence of real, if often prosaic, underground complexity keeps the more sober accounts from sounding dismissive. The persistence of unanswered questions about partially documented civil defense works, decommissioned connections, bricked over arches, keeps speculation alive. And so the city lives with a dual map in its collective imagination. One is made of surveyed tunnels, plotted tracks, known utilities. The other is composed of whispered lines running beneath familiar streets, connecting power to privilege, crime to commerce, past to present. Somewhere between those two maps lies the territory that even engineers still argue about. For all the stories, there is a quieter, stranger fact underneath them. Even among the people who build and maintain this underground world, there is not perfect agreement about what exactly is down there. Part of that is simply paperwork. New York's subsurface is the product of almost 2 centuries of digging, blasting, reinforcing, abandoning, and repurposing. The earliest water tunnels were planned with ink on linen. Some of those drawings are now in archives, some in private collections. Some were lost in fires or thrown out during office cleanups. Early subway contracts specified shafts, headings, cross passages, and temporary works that, on paper, were never meant to be permanent. In practice, once you have a supported void in stable rock, the line between temporary and we'll just leave that often blurred. Over time, companies merged or failed. Private railroads were absorbed into larger systems. Independent subway lines were folded into a unified network. Each transition meant records boxed up, moved, sometimes culled. A set of as-built drawings might show a ventilation chamber under a specific intersection, while a later consolidated plan of the same area omits it because it was considered minor, or because an overworked drafter never copied that layer over. Engineers a century later inherit that patchwork. They open an old plan and find a faint notation. Drift to shaft. Siduang, 14B. Drawing 14B is nowhere to be found. On the ground, a ground-penetrating radar scan hints at a void roughly where the drift should be. No access is apparent. Is it really there? Was it partially backfilled? Did the contractor cut a different alignment than what the designer sketched? Reasonable people, trained in the same discipline, can come to different conclusions. Then there are the places you simply cannot go. Some anomalies lie directly under active tracks carrying thousands of passengers a day. Others are behind walls that are known to be load-bearing, or in soil held back by timber from the 1910s that nobody wants to disturb. In any tunnel system, the first rule is, if it's stable, do not poke it without cause. Curiosity is not cause. So information comes indirectly. A drilling crew working on a new fiber optic conduit might punch through into a small, unexpected cavity. A gap that drops a drill bit for a few feet before it hits something solid. They log the depth, the coordinates, seal the hole, move on. Later, someone overlays that log on a century-old sewer map and realizes the cavity is off by 10 feet from where the old brick line should be. Is the sewer misplotted? Is there a disused parallel run? Did demolition long ago remove one structure and leave a ghost void in the soil? The only way to know for sure would be to open a larger hole, and that means shoring, traffic disruption, money. In the absence of that, arguments live on in meeting rooms and margins of reports. Safety layers, uncertainty on top of uncertainty. Some of the older underground spaces hold conditions that no one is eager to revisit. Asbestos insulation on pipes, lead paint, stagnant water, corroded steel, oxygen-poor pockets. Access hatches might technically exist, but opening them would require confined space, entry teams, air monitoring, specialized gear. When all you're trying to answer is, does that column line end in a solid wall or an arch to something else? The calculation usually comes out in favor of leaving the question open. Ownership does its own distorting work. Beneath any given Manhattan block, you may find city-owned water mains and sewers, a state-run subway line, a private utility's power ducts, a telephone company's manholes, and perhaps a dormant tunnel once built by a railroad that no longer exists as a corporate entity. Some rights-of-way were transferred piecemeal. Some were left legally ambiguous. In practical terms, that can mean that nobody feels entirely responsible for a particular stretch of old masonry under a curb. If an engineer at a transit agency suspects that a mysterious void abuts their tunnel, but the deed for the adjacent land traces back through a chain of now defunct companies, whose budget should pay to investigate? Which lawyer signs off on sending people in? In the gap between legal clarity and practical necessity, it is often easier to document the suspicion, add it to a file, and work around it. Generations of repair and modification further cloud the picture. A tunnel built in 1905 for steam-era traffic might have been widened in the 1920s, had its ceiling raised in the 1940s, its track bed lowered in the 1960s to fit new rolling stock, its utilities rearranged in the 1980s to accommodate new signaling, and its interior sprayed with fireproofing in the 1990s. Each intervention leaves behind anchors, recesses, patched over doorways, and orphaned conduits. When a modern engineer walks through, they are not seeing a neat, single-era design. They are reading palimpsest. Original drawings might show a cross passage between two tubes. Later renovation plans, focused on a specific contract area, might not mention that passage because it lay just outside the scope. A crew in the 1950s might have bricked it up halfway, leaving an odd thickening in the wall. When that same wall is scanned today, the density difference shows up. One engineer, familiar with older brickwork patterns, reads it as an infill door. Another, working from a later set of plans that does not include any mention, dismisses it as simply thicker lining where the rock was weaker. Both interpretations are defensible. Undocumented field alterations magnify the problem. Contractors in the early 20th century sometimes made small changes on site to cope with unexpected rock, water inflows, or utility conflicts, shifting an alignment by a few feet, lowering or raising an invert, adding an extra weep hole or sump. In theory, those changes were supposed to be recorded on as-built plans. In practice, notes penciled in the margins might never have been inked onto the master drawings. A shortcut taken under pressure in 1913 can leave a mystery cavity on a 2024 LiDAR survey. Modern scanning tools, ground-penetrating radar, seismic refraction, microgravity surveys, 3D LiDAR in existing tunnels, have transformed what is knowable without breaking rock. They can reveal hidden voids, variations in soil density, shifts in the alignment of known structures. They are, in a sense, X-rays of the city's bones. But like medical imaging, they have limits, especially in an environment as dense and noisy as New York. Radars bounce off metal, water, and complex stratigraphy. Old trolley rails left in the ground, forgotten steel tie rods, reinforced concrete slabs, even dense rebar mats in relatively shallow basements can create reflections that mask subtler signals deeper down. Seismic methods depend on sending vibrations through the ground, but along a busy avenue, the background noise from traffic, construction, and the subway itself can be overwhelming. Microgravity, which measures tiny changes in gravitational pull to infer voids, is exquisitely sensitive, but so sensitive that nearby high-rise foundations and even the East River's tides can complicate interpretation. Engineers and geophysicists, looking at the same dataset, can reasonably disagree. One might see a coherent anomaly that suggests a small, distinct tunnel or chamber. Another might attribute the same blip to overlapping interference from basement structures, utility trenches, and geological variation. Without direct access, those arguments remain unsettled. The complexity of the legal and physical environment means that even when a tantalizing anomaly shows up, the question is not just what is that, but is it worth finding out? In many cases, the answer is no. If the anomaly is not threatening a foundation, not interfering with a planned project, not obviously related to a safety concern, the conservative decision is to leave it mapped as an unknown and design around it. This is where the gap between conspiracy thinking and mundane reality often opens. From the outside, the fact that officials will acknowledge unknown structures under parts of the city but decline to investigate them sounds like a cover-up. For people used to thinking in terms of risk matrices and budgets, it is simply triage. Every dollar spent opening up a harmless, century-old void is a dollar not spent reinforcing a known, stressed tunnel lining elsewhere. That does not mean the questions are imaginary. It means they queue up on the someday list, waiting for the rare moment when a new project happens to cut through the right spot, or a legitimate safety reason forces a closer look. Occasionally, when that happens, the answer turns out to be exactly what the more conservative engineers predicted. A small construction drift, a test heading, a short-lived conduit left empty when a utility was rerouted. Anomalous, yes. Glamorous, no. But not always. Every once in a while, a contractor breaks through into a brick archway nobody expected to be there, or opens a wall to reveal a narrow corridor aligned with no current plan set. Maybe it dead ends after a few yards. Maybe it turns a corner and quickly collapses into rubble. Those discoveries do not rewrite the map of the city, but they do confirm something subtler, that beneath the official diagrams and the neat online schematics is a messier, partially forgotten reality. That is the terrain where engineers still debate, not because they are hiding a shadow subway for the elite, but because the record of what was actually built, modified, and abandoned is incomplete. And in a living city, it is never worth stopping everything just to tidy up the past. So the unanswered questions remain. Not proof of grand secret networks, but not fully dismissible either. Gaps in the story large enough for folklore to climb through. And somewhere within those gaps sit the things that, even now, might still be down there, waiting for the next necessary excavation to bring them back into the light. The next necessary excavation rarely announces itself as an expedition into mystery. It looks like a contract for a new tower's foundations, a routine sewer replacement, an electrical upgrade, a flood protection project. Yet those are exactly the moments when the city's underground past and its present collide. Most of the surprises that still wait below New York are not going to be found by a team of explorers with flashlights. They will be uncovered by workers in hard hats holding clipboards, whose job is to pour concrete or weld rebar, not decode history. Redevelopment is one of the biggest wildcards. Whenever an old building comes down, especially in lower Manhattan or along old industrial waterfronts, the excavation for the new foundation bites deeper than most of the surrounding basements. That extra 10 or 20 feet can intersect layers that have not been touched since the 19th century or earlier. In some cases, what emerges is archaeological, the remains of 18th century wharves, wooden water pipes, brick cisterns, burial grounds. But in a city layered with tunnels, it can also mean intersecting forgotten infrastructure. A culvert that once carried a stream, a brick-lined passage that's not on any current plan, a chamber whose purpose is now obscure. Developers do not set out to be curators of the underground. They are, however, required to document what they hit. So a site report might quietly log: encountered unexpected void at elevation minus 35 feet. Brick arch, dimensions approximate, filled and sealed as per engineer's direction. That line might be the only written trace of a space that existed in the dark for 100 years, and then for a few weeks as a gap in a pit wall, and then not at all. Infrastructure upgrades create their own windows into the unknown. New trunk sewers and water mains have to thread their way between existing utilities and basements. To do that, planners run test borings, pilot tunnels, and sometimes small-diameter exploratory drives ahead of the main excavation. Those advanced probes occasionally intersect cavities no one anticipated. A driller might suddenly lose pressure as the bit drops into a void, then bite back into firm material below. A microtunnel boring machine might briefly run through unsupported air before hitting an old wall head-on. Inside the control room, the readings spike, then normalize. On site, engineers gather, compare notes, scan old plans, and make a judgment call. Is this an isolated anomaly that can be grouted, or the edge of something larger that needs to be opened up? Floods and collapses are less controlled, but sometimes even more revealing. When Superstorm Sandy pushed salt water into subway tubes and utility tunnels, maintenance teams had to inspect flooded sections inch by inch afterward. In a few locations, the force of water scoured away backfill, exposing old masonry structures that had been entirely encased for decades. A curve of brick, a blind arched opening, a pocket of void that no one had any reason to suspect, revealed not by design, but by damage. Localized collapses can do something similar on a smaller scale. A sinkhole opens in a street after heavy rain. Crews pull up the asphalt and find that the soil has washed into a small adjacent cavity. They shore the edges, climb down, and discover part of a disused culvert, or the roof of a narrow passage that was once a coal chute or service tunnel, later extended, then abandoned. The hole gets filled, the surface repaved, the traffic restored. The only sign that anything was learned is an updated line in a subsurface database, marking that point as void encountered and treated. Then there's the quiet revolution in how the underground is surveyed. As budgets allow, more utilities and agencies are commissioning comprehensive 3D subsurface models. Compilations of radar surveys, borehole logs, old plans, and LiDAR scans. These digital twins of the city's underbelly can sometimes make ghost structures visible in ways that walking a tunnel never would. In a composite model, you might see a known subway tube, a documented sewer crossing beneath it, a cluster of power ducts above, and then, just off to one side, a curious cigar-shaped anomaly in the rock. too big to be a random fissure, oddly regular in its outline, with just enough consistency across different data sets to suggest it's not an artifact. It might be a long-forgotten test heading, a contractor's bypass tunnel, an early alignment abandoned when a route change was ordered. Or it might be nothing more than a quirk in the data. The temptation is to read every anomaly as a hidden tunnel. The reality is more mundane. But the cumulative effect of these finds and near finds is a growing awareness that the underground city we think we know is at best an approximation. What then might still actually be down there? On the most prosaic level, short segments of unfinished headings, blind shafts, side chambers dug as temporary pump rooms or storage spaces during construction and then bricked up. Little pockets of air preserved because removing them would have cost time and money no one wanted to spend. There may be more substantial relics of earlier systems, stretches of brick sewers built along now buried streams that were partly replaced but not entirely removed, sections of early transit tunnels from short-lived schemes, forgotten basements and service corridors from demolished stations or depots that were simply cut off and left. There are likely to be engineering experiments, pilot tunnels driven to test rock conditions under the East River or beneath a prospective station site, then abandoned when routes shifted or funding dried up. Some were documented, some were not. A few might still exist as intact, if damp and corroded, tubes in the dark. Then there are the traces of communities in Lower Manhattan, where entire neighborhoods were reshaped by landfill, street regrading, and large-scale construction. Basement levels of older buildings were sometimes effectively buried. Cellars that once opened at sidewalk level became subcellars when the structures above them were demolished. Not every foundation was entirely removed. In places, it's plausible that segments of those lower spaces, brick walls, stair treads, fragments of flooring, still linger, walled off on all sides by later construction. Elsewhere in the city, tunnels that once connected industrial buildings, breweries, or waterfront warehouses may have been truncated by new highways and parks, their accessible ends sealed. The portions that now lie under public right-of-way are effectively orphaned, not worth the expense to remove, not dangerous enough to demand attention, simply existing in a legal and literal gray zone. If those spaces were to be opened, they would not reveal a secret city in the cinematic sense. They would show us layers of decision-making, how engineers in 1890 solved a problem with the tools they had, how officials in 1920 prioritized certain routes over others, how landlords coped with changing regulations and street levels. In the details, the brick bonds, the pipe sizes, the ad hoc supports, you can read the constraints and attitudes of the time. You might also glimpse evidence of people whose names do not appear in headline histories. Graffiti scratched in old tunnel linings by laborers. Makeshift sleeping spaces used during hard winters, before entrances were welded shut. Traces of small, unofficial uses of semi-abandoned spaces. Storage for a nearby shop, an improvised workshop wired off a lighting circuit, a prayer area or meeting spot tucked into a dry chamber before someone in authority decided it was a liability. Those remnants, if and when they are found, pose a dilemma. Preserve them, and you complicate already difficult projects, slowing down work that is supposed to improve safety or capacity. Document and destroy them, and you erase some of the few tangible links to underrepresented stories in the city's evolution. Leave them untouched and you accept the risk, however minor, that an unknown void might someday interact badly with new loads, leaks, or shocks. For agencies tasked with keeping trains running and water flowing, the priority is almost always clear. Public safety and system reliability first. A mysterious chamber that lies in the way of a flood protection tunnel will be breached, inspected briefly, recorded, then filled or reinforced. The city cannot afford to turn every encounter with the past into an excavation season. Yet preservationists and historians argue, often persuasively, that some of these discoveries deserve more than a few photographs and a line in a report. They see in every old arch and buried wall an opportunity to understand how New York grew, how neighborhoods shifted, how planning philosophies changed. In their view, the underground is an archive, and each unexamined page is a loss. Between those positions sits a constant tension. The more we modernize the underground, adding storm surge barriers, expanding transit capacity, hardening utilities, the more we disturb whatever lies in the path. At the same time, modernization is what keeps the city functioning in the face of rising seas, heavier storms, and aging infrastructure. You cannot freeze the underground in amber and still expect it to serve a living metropolis. So decisions are made case by case. A particularly intact remnant of an early sewer might be carefully documented, perhaps incorporated into a new design as a visible feature in a station or public space. A small, structurally insignificant void might be grouted without ceremony. Most finds fall somewhere between, recorded just enough to satisfy contract requirements and the curiosity of the engineers on site. In that pragmatic, sometimes hurried process, you can see why the deepest mysteries of New York's underground remain what they are. Not elaborate conspiracies, but a blend of thoroughly documented projects and stubborn gaps in the record. Every new survey closes some of those gaps. Every unplanned discovery opens new questions. And above it all, millions of people move through the city, unaware that beneath their roots lie sealed rooms, ghost conduits, fragments of older streets and structures, spaces mapped only in fragments, or not at all. The next time a road is torn up, a station is rebuilt, a new tunnel is bored, some small corner of that hidden world may again come briefly into view before being folded back into the fabric. Until then, much of New York remains, quite literally, out of sight, a layered, imperfectly known landscape under the pavement, where the line between what we can point to on a plan and what we can only infer on a scan is still shifting, and where future surprises are less a matter of if than when and what and how quickly they will be covered over again. New York likes to tell its story in steel and glass, in skylines and time-lapse sunsets. But by now, you know that is only the visible draft. Beneath the streets, there's another city. Not a single coherent network, not a neatly planned realm, but a palimpsest. Tunnels that never connected, shafts that ended in rock, culverts that outlived the streams they once carried, vaults that briefly mattered and then didn't, layers of intent and improvisation stacked so closely that engineers today sometimes discover their predecessors' work not in archives, but by accident. Some of what seems mysterious at first glance has straightforward answers once you trace the paperwork far enough back. A strange curve in a wall lines up with an abandoned alignment on a 1905 drawing. A blind arch in a tunnel is all that remains of a provision for a station entrance that was never funded. A sealed door in a subway passage turns out to be a fire break, built for a contingency that never came. Other finds resist that kind of neat resolution. A chamber appears in a construction pit with no clear mention in the records. An anomaly shows up consistently across different subsurface surveys, regular enough to suggest design, but unattributed to any known project. A small segment of tunnel, carefully finished, leads nowhere on any current map. The explanations multiply: early experiments, private schemes, utility bypasses, wartime contingencies, surveying errors turned into physical space. None are provably wrong. Few are fully satisfying. That tension between what can be documented and what can only be inferred is where much of the intrigue lies. The underground city is not unknowable, but it is not fully known either. It is a place where municipal pragmatism and human curiosity meet and often talk past each other. Engineers are trained to solve problems, not to romanticize them. If a void threatens a structure, it will be filled. If an undocumented conduit conflicts with a new line, it will be cut and rerouted. The mystery becomes a line item, then a change order, then a photograph in a project archive. To the people responsible for keeping trains running and basements dry, that is exactly as it should be. Yet the very need for those interventions reveals how incomplete even the best maps are. For all the digital models, bore logs, and scanned blueprints, New York still has spaces underfoot that no one alive has seen, and that no one has a reason to visit unless forced. A modern metropolis, constantly measured and monitored, still carries within it pockets of uncertainty. In a way, that is the most striking takeaway. The stories of buried creeks, phantom platforms, deep-level passages, and sealed doors are not just trivia. They are evidence of how a city evolves in 3 dimensions and across time. Every tunnel reflects a moment's priorities and fears, a budget, a technology, a guess about the future. Every forgotten passage says something about how those guesses aged. And even now, as the underground is modeled more precisely than ever before, those models keep turning up oddities, shapes in the data that hint at past decisions we have not yet rediscovered. The city under the city remains an active construction site and a partially opened archive at the same time. So the next time you ride a subway or cross a bridge, it's worth remembering that the true depth of New York is not just geological, it's historical, infrastructural, and in some places, still unresolved. A city that appears so thoroughly mapped can still hide questions with no definitive answer. Brick curves that don't quite line up with the plans, voids that exist only as spikes on a survey chart, rumors that are stubborn precisely because the evidence is thin. If this journey through New York's hidden layers has sparked new questions for you, let them linger. Wonder what might be just beyond that sealed wall, or beneath that ordinary corner you pass every day. And if you'd like to see more deep dives into the forgotten and unexplained parts of the built world, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. I'd love to hear your perspective too. Tell me in the comments what surprised you most, what theories you find most convincing, and where in the world you're listening from. Because under almost every city, not just New York, there's another story waiting in the dark, half documented, half imagined, and not quite finished.